The Houston Rockets almost did what everybody thought would be impossible. They were on the verge of knocking off the Warriors in a 7-game series, but at the last moment, Chris Paul went down with an injury and it was over, just like that. Paul is not new to injuries. He's had his fair share of them, particularly in the playoffs where it seems like he's gotten injured almost every year in recent memory. How's it going, fellas? My name's Andy, and in this video, we're going to take a look at Chris Paul's interesting yet conflicting NBA career. But before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to my sponsor, SeatGeek. SeatGeek is an app that aggregates ticket prices from all over the web to help you find the best deals for games, concerts, Broadway shows, and other events. The prices marked in green are good, while the ones in red are bad. The app is very easy to use, and you can also see the view from your seats before you buy them, which is my favorite feature. Use my promo code ANDY at checkout to get $20 off your first order. Thank you to SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. What is Chris Paul's legacy anyway? What will people remember him for? He's one of the most polarizing players in history in terms of all-time ranking and public perception. Some people flat out hate him because of his flops and his antics. Some people love him because he goes 110% every game. About a year ago, I made a video about Chris Paul, but a lot has changed since then. Now he's on a new team and was one game away from reaching the finals. The career of Chris Paul is quite an interesting one. It's hard to sum it up in just a few words. Coming into the NBA, he was projected to be a star and the ideal point guard. His draft comparison was Isaiah Thomas, which turned out to be very accurate. Before the draft, Paul was described as a consummate point guard, a mature leader, wise beyond his years. He can score and get into the paint and drop the catchable pass with the best of them, and his passion for the game will keep him from falling off. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed. That was the perfect description of any player I've ever seen. The scouts were spot on. At the age of 22, Paul finished second in the MVP race behind Kobe Bryant. This was his third season in the league, and he led the Hornets to a 56-26 record and pushed the defending champion Spurs to 7 games before losing. He had an amazing regular season and playoff run that year, putting up some ridiculous numbers. In the playoffs, he averaged 24, 11, and 5 with fewer than 2 turnovers a game. Paul's insane assist-to-turnover ratio is well documented. He has the highest ratio in NBA history, along with the second highest assist percentage ever behind John Stockton. CP3 also finished top 6 in MVP voting in 5 other seasons, yet nobody talks about it. When anyone looks at Paul's resume, they just see, oh, he has 0 MVPs. And that is true, but there's more to it. For example, I've seen people use the argument that because Steve Nash won MVP twice and made more conference finals, he should be ranked higher than Paul, which is reasonable. But personally, I think Paul's 9-time All-Defense, despite being barely 6 feet tall, is way more impressive than Nash's MVPs. Basically, I just believe he's the better player. Unfortunately, Paul did not see the same success with the Hornets again. In early 2010, he suffered a pretty serious knee injury. It required arthroscopic surgery and forced him to miss nearly half the season. When he returned around March, he looked like a shell of his former self. The Hornets also missed the playoffs without him. I know it sounds weird, but Paul used to be extremely athletic and explosive. He used to play a lot differently compared to right now, where he's much slower and calculated. Age is obviously part of the reason, but this knee surgery was also a huge deal. In the season right after the surgery, Paul's stats dropped across the board, and from the eye test, he looked a lot slower than before, like he lost his once explosive first step. Some thought he would never return back to normal, but in the 2011 playoffs, he proved that he was still amazing, as he played arguably the best playoff series of his career from an individual standpoint. The Hornets still lost in the first round to the Lakers, but Paul silenced his doubters, proving that he was still an elite point guard. As his career progressed, he continued to refine his game, developing into a remarkably better shooter, which was somewhat of a weakness when he was younger. To be honest, it was probably his only weakness, cause after becoming one of the best shooters in the league, CP3 is now arguably the most complete point guard the NBA has ever seen. When we look back at his time with the Clippers, there's a lot of mixed opinions. There were times when he choked at the end of games, especially in the 2004 series against OKC. They were on the verge of going up 3-2, but a series of turnovers and a bad foul by Paul lost them the game. There was also that other time when his team blew a 3-1 lead to the Rockets, which a lot of people criticize him for because, well, they should have won the series in Game 6 if Paul closed it out. Even though he was great in the series overall, there were times at the end of games where the rest of his team was struggling, but Paul was either too passive or too tired to do anything. It's reasonable that he gets some flack. In general, his entire Clippers tenure was basically this. CP3 was a great player, a perennial top 10 player in the league, but because he couldn't lead his team past the second round, it was hard to evaluate him. He also injured his hamstring in 2015 and then broke his hand in 2016. Griffin also had a similar situation where he'd unfortunately get injured when playoff time came. The Clippers had a lot of bad luck in the years that they should have been contending. Anyway, around this time, there were always people who value team success more than individual stats, and those people did not think highly of CP3. But there's another group who said that CP3 is already a top 5 point guard of all time, even though he didn't have much team success because his individual stats are absurdly good. Right now, his career win shares per 48 minutes is number 1 in the entire history of the NBA, even higher than Michael Jordan. His offensive rating is also number 1. His career box plus minus is number 3, behind only MJ and LeBron. That's insanely impressive. Like I mentioned earlier, he has the best assist-to-turnover ratio in history, and he's also a brutally efficient scorer, to the point where he would barely ever attempt a bad shot. Now that CP3 has actually got past the second round and reached the conference finals, the team success argument is no longer valid, especially since it looked like the Rockets could have very well won the series if he didn't get hurt. Sure, he may not be the best player on this team anymore, but he still carried the team in multiple games when Harden was struggling. And in the series against the Warriors, he was very clutch, scoring the majority of his points in the second halves. This is kinda off topic, but I find the whole thing about being clutch or unclutch to be very misleading. And here's why. Let's use Russell Westbrook for example. In recent years, he's been known to be very clutch down the stretch, hitting multiple game-winning shots, which is great and he deserves all the praise. But the thing is, if Westbrook didn't spend the other 90% of the game taking bad shots and throwing up bricks, then his team would not need a game winner to win. If he just hit more of his shots throughout the game, or even shot a league average efficiency, the Thunder would win by like 10 points. So there's no game winner needed. I mean, recently he hit a game winner against the Kings, but do you really think the Thunder should have needed a game winner against the Kings in the first place? So how does this apply to CP3? Well, it's because there used to be this whole misconception that he was unclutch. But some people didn't consider the fact that he's the reason why the Clippers were in the game to begin with. Another argument people use against Paul is the whole numbers aren't everything. Despite having great box score stats and amazing advanced stats, which are on par with LeBron and MJ, Paul has not translated that into more success. And part of that is true, numbers aren't everything, but it doesn't make sense to use that against him. Looking beyond the numbers and just using the eye test, Paul is one of the scrappiest players in the league. He plays consistently great defense that doesn't show up in the box score. He does a lot of little things like pushing people off with his elbow every time he drives to gain the advantage. He fights through screens and even holds his own against taller players. He flops sometimes and complains a lot, but he only does it to help his team win, even if the other fans hate him for doing it. That's how competitive he is. If anything, if you put his numbers aside and just watch him play, he looks just as good. Anyway, that sums up the video. I think Paul has been unfairly criticized for the majority of his career because of his lack of team success and some antics. But make no mistake, he's one of the greatest players of all time. Among point guards, I'd probably put him at number 6 behind Magic, Isaiah, Oscar, Curry, and Stockton. But as an individual talent, I think he's better than all of them besides Magic. He just doesn't have the championships that they do or the longevity of Stockton, who also happens to hold the all-time assist and steals record. That's why right now I wouldn't put him ahead of them. It's just my opinion though, he could be even higher than number 6, but he can also be closer to number 10, depending on how you compare him to guys like Nash, Kidd, and Peyton. Where do you guys rank him? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Visit my store at hoopsgold.com for my latest basketball merchandise. And as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.